Okay, so yeah. So I was wondering, like, do you have anything on your mind before I jump in, or should I just jump in with my questions?
No, please jump in.
Okay, so I guess where I wanted to start, Sid, is just to get a sense of the whole background of how you thought about this company, and especially as you were thinking about this company, how you thought about all remote. So just going back in time, if you can walk me through like the whole process and the thinking as it evolved.
For sure. So the first employee of the company was based in Serbia. So it wasn't practical to bring him to the Netherlands, and it was not practical for me to go to Serbia. So that was remote. Then we hired Dimitri. Dimitri was in the Ukraine, so that wasn't practical either. And then I hired a couple of people in the Netherlands. So it was practical for them to come. I had an extra desk at my home, and we worked from there. And then I think kind of day 3 or day 4, they didn't show up. And thought about it, like, where are they? They were online, so we just continued working. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to tell them to show up tomorrow. It's like, well, it's 2 hours, or like it's 1.5 hours for them, extra time spent. Are we going to get 1.5 hours of extra efficiency? No, probably not. And we, in the first couple of days, we already covered a lot of like the things that, the onboarding things that are actually a bit easier to do in person, just asking a ton of questions. The second, and then I continued hiring people in the Netherlands, and continually they kind of stopped showing up after a couple of days.
And where were you based in the Netherlands at that time?
I was based in Utrecht, 10 minutes from the biggest train station in the Netherlands.
Okay, and that's your home? That
was my home, yep. Then we did Y Combinator. We lived in the same house with almost all of the company. That was effective and intense. And I think there's something to be said. If you're one team of people and you can be in the same room together and you have to move quickly, I'm definitely supportive of doing that in person. After that, everyone went back home because they were away from the people they care most about. And Y Combinator said, look, this whole remote thing, our coaches at Y Combinator said, it kind of works for engineering, doesn't work for the other things. So consider getting an office. And I thought that was good advice. You see, typical flaw of technical, like product-focused CEOs is that they think they can reinvent management. Like you tend to see that as a lot where, we're not going to have any middle management here. I strongly believe in that. I believe in middle management and sales. And I thought, look, let's not fall into that same trap by being adamant about having to be remote. So we got an office. It housed 15 people before. I think we had to, that was a bit much. They had to put a big fan in the door opening to keep it cool. So
what is this? This is in the...
This is in San Francisco. So this was after Y Combinator in San Francisco at the 8th and Howard above Mike's Bikes. We put 8 desks in there. And I think the first person to show up there was our salesperson. He's been with the company for a while, but now he could finally come to the office. And he stopped coming after a couple of days. And the same pattern continued. Like people came in a few days and they stopped coming. And it was basically because we were so used to kind of using systems correctly, using a remote work style, using Slack, using video calls, using Google Docs, using GitLab issues, using GitLab merge requests. We were just used to that way of working. And then a few times it's been contentious where people said, I don't know about this, mostly executive hiring. So, and And then they come in and they talk to the other execs. They were like, well, this is was my first remote company as well, but like I'm actually having easier time reaching people here than at my previous job because everyone is super good about responding to messages. Everyone is super good at reading things here. And then we thought it wouldn't work for SDRs. SDRs are the sales development representatives who reach out to enterprises, and thought they're just out of school. They kind of, and it's a tough job. You hear a lot of no's, so they need the camaraderie of being together. Then we found a couple of great SDRs in Utah, and we're not going to make them move. So even that ended up, and then at a certain point, we just decided, okay, this works. Almost nobody in the company actually wants to come to an office because it's a waste of time. And the worst thing you can do is have a hybrid company where some people are at the office and they use those communication styles, and some people are remote and they use different communication styles, because that leads to a lot of inefficiency. So, and we decided to become remote. Our investors were super worried about it. They said, look, there's very few remote companies at scale. At the time, there was WordPress and InVision was already coming up. And we're like, okay, well, we're going to be pragmatic. As soon as we have this big breakdown in the leadership team or something, we'll reconsider it. That didn't happen. At a certain point, we decided that, we're pretty sure this scale's a lot better. We're actually able to grow faster and have less disconnect between the leadership team than in other companies.
And who are the larger investors right now in the company, Sid?
So these conversations about remote or not were mainly with the early investors, Khosla Ventures and August Capital. Right now, Iconic is also a big shareholder, and the seed round was done by Google Ventures, GV. And
Khosla and August were skeptical of this model?
Yeah, they were skeptical of this model. They've turned from skeptics into advocates. They've seen our ability to hire outpacing their portfolio companies. They've seen our ability to retain people and our cost structure being much better. So they're now actually starting to focus on companies that are all remote because they think it's a big competitive advantage.
So I'm going to come to the future and and sort of scaling up. But before that, so, through my conversations, one of the things that strikes me as really interesting is, given that you're all remote, there's no headquarters, right? But, the 30, 40 years of management thinking has been about how the headquarters really is important in terms of performing many functions. So the question really is, though you don't have a physical headquarters, there has to be headquarter functions. And so what are the most important functions that you think of when you look around your exec team? And could you tell me how you perform those functions in an all remote way?
Yeah, I'm going to interpret your question as like a headquarter. There's two parts of it. There's how do you bring multiple functions together in a company, and the functions that a headquarter has in bringing people together. For example, at Pixar, they were really thoughtful about how they designed their headquarter, and the same thing with the new Apple headquarter. For the latter, I think it's really important to be intentional about informal communication, and even more so if you're not co-located. So there's a lot of different things we do, and I'd love to elaborate on them to facilitate remote communication. As for bringing together different functions, GitLab is a functionally organized company, which means that we're very capital efficient. There's great career progress. People have great managers. The problem tends to be the interaction between the functions, different functions doing different things and not coordinating effectively. Things we do to mitigate that are, for example, having a group conversation every day where a function presents what they're working on and everyone can chime in. Having OKRs to make sure that the goals for the quarter for all the different functions are aligned. And there's more to, and a couple of other things. But that's maybe, I'll stop here and allow you to ask further questions.
Yeah, so let me ask a specific question. So one of the functions in my research and consulting work with large companies like Microsoft and Infosys and Google, one of the critical functions the headquarter plays is resource allocation, internal capital budgeting, right? And the way it works, as you would know really well, is the frontline people, they spot new ideas, they socialize these ideas with middle managers, then you prepare some sort of like a forecast of profitability. Then there's some internal budgeting meeting at the headquarters where all the functions, finance and marketing and technology would come together, and the CEO would say, this is a go, this is a no-go, and this is a go, and this is a no-go. And then you would track that every quarterly based on QBRs or whatever. So this whole internal resource allocation process, I'm just curious how it happens in your context.
Yeah. We try to prevent cross-functional decisions as much as possible because they are extremely expensive. An example of that in the small is what we will work on next month for our product. It used to be that was a big cross-functional meeting with a lot of engineering managers and a lot of product managers in it. And we changed it to the product managers will decide what engineering will work on, full stop. And everyone in the company, whether it's sales, whether it's external, people external to the company, whether it's engineers, can argue with that product manager to change their mind. But it's their responsibility. And we call this principle directly responsible individual. They are the DRI. They make the decision. You can try to change their mind. It's a continuous thing. Like there's always a next month. We can even make adaptations. At a bigger scale, we have our eventual cost model. Like in a steady state where we're not growing as fast as we're growing now, we'd like to spend this much on sales, this much on marketing, have a 20% EBITDA margin, etc. How we allocate the money now is on, they're all on a slope to get to that eventual model. So every department has their allocation, and it's largely up to them to decide how to spend that money within their company. Now, there's always examples of cross-functional things. For example, we have a project called Meltano, which is kind of a separate product, completely separate from GitLab. We made that a separate team with its own general manager and kept it totally outside of the functional hierarchy, so that the functional hierarchy is like not occupied with this project at all, because that is very expensive communication.
But who decides, Sid, how much budget each DRI would have? It has to be some top-down allocation of budget, right?
Yeah, so we have our eventual, like suppose our eventual model is that sales will have 20% of budget. Right now we're growing fast. I suppose it's now 35% of budget. That money goes to sales. I think so it's very clear how much budget each function has. I think the only hard thing to solve for has been, how does engineering allocate their headcount against all the different parts of the project? Sure. Engineering can say, okay, we're spending this much in Q&A, we're spending this much in documentation, we're spending this much in that they can decide because they know their gearing ratios. How much to spend in the different kind of parts of the product? We have like a planning component and a monitoring component and 8 other components to the product. But do we put an extra team on planning or do we put an extra team on monitoring? That's up to product, because product knows like what the market wants, where they want to go, where they want to drive the roadmap, where they will need most capacity. So that's kind of been the only thing where there's a very extensive collaboration. Product will make a proposal. Engineering will make sure it's all practical, that we don't end up with half people or infeasible teams. Even I have a look at it because I'm a product-driven CEO. But it's mainly product who sets those priorities with input from other people, but in the end, they decide.
But just to keep pushing that, so when you said that sales knows this year that they have 40% of the budget, that decision has to be made first, right? So I'm guessing, do you make that decision in your your co-locations, or
No,
do you
we
have?
don't. That's not a decision that follows from a model. So we have a model for that, and
Okay.
it's a glide path from the old spend to the steady state. And I could we have more extensive documentation. We're preparing a blog post about that.
So there's a quantitative model which says this year how much will be allocated to sales and product and all these other functions.
Exactly. And that's in our forecast, and people can just, so engineering, what's our headcount for going to be? Well, look at the forecast for next year. You know how much money you're going to spend and figure out your headcount.
So tell me about this model, like who developed it, what was the set of inputs, and how do you update this model?
So there's two components to it. One is the eventual steady state. How much are we going to spend on every part of the company? Finance developed that by looking at comparables and kind of, okay, we're more product heavy than others. This is about how much enterprise we do. So they developed those numbers. And it's a model like people want to know if you, like, for example, go public, investors want to know that eventual model, like how you're going to turn a profit.
Sure.
And then we made a formula to get on a glide path. And that formula is basically, it's a bit inspired by the rule of 40. Are you familiar with that by any chance?
No, I'm not.
So the rule of 40 is the best practice that if you add up your EBITDA margin and your growth rate, you should be about above 40%. And if you combine that with this, like, so we can spend a higher percentage of our revenue on sales as long as we keep growing really fast. So that's the formula we made to set that.
And do you have a split? Like, can it be really small EBITDA but high growth, or can it be really large EBITDA and low growth? Or as long as it's within 40, you don't care.
Exactly. It can be very negative EBITDA, but extremely high growth, which is the current case.
Yeah. And so then, like, after doing that for a few quarters, hypothetically, if you start running out of cash, don't you have to then go and update the model? And
well, the trick is to not run out of cash. So you can, with this model, you can predict your cash flow. So the only way to run out of cash is if your revenue is not growing at the rate you anticipated, and the action you take if that happens is like you slow down hiring to make sure you fall back within the model.
So maybe what I'll do is say, like, tell me, as a CEO, you said you are a product-focused CEO. Tell me what a typical week in your life would look at. Like, so talking to the investors, talking to products. So tell me, like, what would be the set of activities that you as a CEO perform in a typical week?
Yeah. Shadows, I'm going to hand it over to you after I had a first stab at this. Typically, there's different things. Like there's calls with the entire company. For example, this week I did a group conversation. We had a values conversation where the whole company was invited. It's external meetings, mainly to promote like all remote and some thought leadership meetings like this. There's hiring, interviews, there's talking with advisors. There's my one-on-ones with my direct reports. There's skip level meetings with the reports of my reports. There's just busy work, like I had to sign some documents to incorporate in analysts, software analysts who want to know about our vision. There's one customer that was kind of unlucky, and I have now a weekly call to make sure that everything that they need will get really, really fast. There's outreach in the ecosystem, so kind of other companies and developers that we might want to collaborate with. Shadows, you want to add to that?
I'll add that there's also involvement in conferences, and this week is a good example where Sid had to deliver a keynote at Multi-CloudCon in San Diego. So outreach in that format.
I would also add one more thing to add is that Sid's also very intentional about taking time to speak with his family every day. So that's on his calendar. And then he does block off one night a week to go on a date with his wife. So
yeah.
Thanks for that, Gabe.
Yeah. And how many direct reports do you have, and who are they?
Yeah, so I can show you the org chart, and thank you to Chanye for your contribution. I forgot about the conference. So this is our org chart. And you'll see I'll have 11 direct reports and 129 indirect reports. Total reports.
And so do you have like a sort of quasi team call with your, the font is really small. Is it 19 direct reports you said?
I have 10 direct reports.
10 direct reports. So do you have like a call with all 10 at any frequency, or you just talk?
Yeah, for sure. So once a week we have an e-group call. So that's CFO, CRO, CMO, CPO, VP of Eng, VP of Prod, VP of Product Strategy, a future General Counsel.
Okay, so just go slowly through that. So it's yourself,
Chief Financial Officer, Chief Revenue Officer, like think sales, marketing, people. So that's people operations and recruiting, engineering, product, strategy, and legal.
Okay, and these are all virtual calls, right?
Yeah, they're real calls in Zoom.
Yeah. I like that. So, and beyond that, you also mentioned that you periodically co-locate, you meet somewhere. So last year, I believe it was in New Orleans, and then you're doing it again in Prague next year, right? So, so are those meetings like pretty similar to the meetings you have on Zoom, or are they different in any way?
They're completely different. We not only are they not, we don't do the regular work. We don't allow, for example, when we all come together for a week, we don't do like death by PowerPoint. We don't have big presentations. We have an opening and a closing ceremony where it's like a talk at a conference. But throughout the week, there's no projectors, there's no presentations. Half of the time we spend on excursions, just going out and visiting the place together and just chatting and meeting people that we work with and new people. And the other half is an unconference where people propose subjects to talk about in a group of 15 people. And that's an like an informal conversation centered around subjects like burnout versus another one with lack of motivation.
Cool. So Sid, like, let me move to the future then. So, because, as you know, the case that we're going to write will have to focus on some, managerial question that people can debate, right? And the thing that I was thinking about was how you scale this model to the next level. So hypothetically, you are at about 1,000 something now. As you see this model being scaled up to say 5,000 or even 10,000, where do you feel, given your experience in the past like few years, this could break? So what are the key concerns that keep you up at night, so to say?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a good question to debate, because this model scales a lot better than co-located models. So if you're co-located all in the same room, that works well. If you're all on the same floor, okay. If you're on the same building, meh. If you're on the same city, same state, same continent, it gets harder and harder and harder. So at scale, all remote works better because the practices that you need at scale, like extensive asynchronous communication, like documenting and writing down and recording things, those practices, they help you scale. So it's not, all remote becomes a bigger benefit as you scale, not a smaller one. So this idea it breaks at a certain point is very foreign to me. And if you think that many people would debate that, I'd be happy to work with you on that question, or we can also discuss alternative questions.
No, so I think, I would love to, brainstorm alternative questions, but let me tell you what I've heard, right? So, and in my, 4 or 5 calls so far, so if I list the sort of like frictions, and I'm not saying none of these can be solved, but there are frictions like in any model. So one friction that people talked about was time zones and the challenges of communicating across time zones, right? A related thing, which I think is a very interesting thing to debate, is people talked about how new hires, especially when you're hiring a lot super fast, could come in with a very different way of communication, right? They could be used to email, and they may not like really understand the whole the sense of using Slack and GitLab issues. But more importantly, they might be very consensus driven people. They might have come to an work for organizations where you are all collocated, you develop consensus, and then you start an initiative. And I guess what I've been told is your model is completely the opposite, where you are putting out an idea and you are asking people to react to that. And I can go through more issues that we raised, but let's talk about these two. So the time zones, and as you scale up, how you solve or not solve issues there. And then the whole issue about hiring people who have been steeped in a different way of working, and how you change their cultural priors in terms of communication and being proactive.
Yeah, I think all three of those are excellent things. I'd love to go into them. Sure. I don't think that any of them are related to operating at a certain scale. Regarding time zones, they are the bane of our existence. They are very hard to deal with. Although the only way to deal with time zones is to work as asynchronously as possible. However, we do not believe that asynchronous communication is beneficial for all situations. In situations where there's a lot of back and forth, it's much more efficient to hop on a call where you can quickly interact. Because if you can't, you have to kind of think about all the possible questions someone will have and then address them up front, because otherwise you lose another interaction cycle. And that's inefficient, and it's much easier to ask, hey, do you understand? Do you have context? Or someone just interrupting you if they can't follow anymore. Sure. There's also a certain amount of connection and compassion that comes with being in a video call versus communicating on chat. And those two things you lose if you don't have synchronous communication. And synchronous communication across time zones is very, very hard. I don't know how to solve time zones. I don't think anybody does. We do know how to do as a lot of asynchronous communication, but there's we don't want to go to like always doing asynchronous communication, because we know it's not the most efficient thing for every situation. And how we deal with it, for example, I just merged something. I have the CEO Shadow program, which you're familiar with. And I just merged that if you're in the Asia Pacific region, you get a special consideration for eligibility to that program, so that we also get some people from that part of the world, because so far no one from that part of the world came. And it's very important to keep people in that part connected, because for them, many of our meetings are not at great times for them. Regarding new hires, that's a big, onboarding is so important. We do a better job than any other company in the world, but it can always be better. For example, we started office hours for people with kind of IT problems. I think we're not doing a good job of making people familiar with our values, with our communication methods, and with how to use GitLab. So actually, we had that conversation earlier today, and I put in a proposal to our chief people officer whether I could have an early start with making a learning management system that tests for those things, so that we're absolutely sure that people who join the company are familiar with those things. The last thing is about consensus and how we make decisions. Is it helpful if I elaborate a bit on our model on how to make decisions?
Yes.
So it's documented on our leadership page, and they'll put it in the chat. The idea is we want to combine the best of consensus organizations and hierarchical organizations. And thanks for that deep link, Gabe. How we get consensus, the best of consensus organization, when we are about to make a decision, we tell everyone. We do that in a forum that's accessible to the entire company, or frequently to the entire world. And everyone can give input. How we keep the best of hierarchical organizations is by having a DRI. There's one person who will decide. Now, there's one tricky thing here. If you make the DRI kind of convince or explain their decision too much to all the people who provided input, you will get projects that fly under the radar. And that's what I've seen in a lot of companies. So very explicitly, the DRI does not have to explain why they're taking the decision, and they absolutely don't have to convince other people. So you get to provide input, but you don't have the right to like feeling heard or being considered in the eventual decision.
That's very helpful. Yeah. And so the question, Sid, really is, I guess it's also an onboarding question, right? So if someone's new and has not been familiar with this new model of working, it's a question of just how do you change that person's mindset to this new culture, right?
Yeah, I think we should do a better job of surfacing it. I'm pretty sure that this making decisions part of our handbook, that no one who onboards it actually reads this part of our handbook, or no one, like less than 5%. So we should make it part of like the curriculum, and we should test whether they can answer a basic question about like, hey, why is it a problem if you have to make sure everyone feels heard? And Gabe and Chenya maybe have a look at the language, because I think we want to have some strong language in there that says, look, as a DRI, it's not even your task to make sure people feel heard, because that will lead to decisions flying under the radar, because the more people will know about a decision, the more work it is. Yeah,
makes sense. So two more things. And by the way, Sid, I'm a huge fan of this work from anywhere model. And that's why I was very excited to work on this. But, you know, we have to document and then discuss in the class, because people will be thinking about these, right? So the two other things that, you know, we heard, and I would like to get your thoughts on, relate to, like, if I'm a really young person and I'm very motivated, it's easy to get into a mode of working constantly and suffering burnout very soon, right?
Yes.
And relatedly, there was I think one of the people I spoke to yesterday said, this is a great model if you know how to manage your social life proactively. But if you are someone who's an introvert, the isolation can be terrible, right? And I wonder, I'm sure you've thought about it, and I'm curious how you've thought about dealing this at scale.
Yeah, those are great things. Thanks for bringing that up. There is the risk of overworking, and it's a very big risk, because you don't have this separation between your personal life and your company life in time and place. People can work too much. One of the things we do is to never celebrate people working outside of office hours. And today someone brought up that we do sometimes celebrate people who have a very active commit graph, because it means they did a lot, but very frequently those people also have commits in the weekends. So this morning we discussed a feature that allows you to remove the weekend days from that commit graph. So people cannot even see it. We also have the rule that like managers cannot ask people about how many hours they worked unless they seriously suspect you're working too many hours. One of the things we require, one of our selection criteria, is that people should be a manager of one. They should be able to manage their own time. We also try to make it a frequent topic of mental health, a frequent topic of conversation. Like we have sections in the handbook about it. We're working on all remote section. We have contracted with a provider called Modern Health that's accessible at no cost to anybody in the company. I'm not saying it's something we solved, but we're aware of it. We're doing better than most companies. It's also, we're trying to lead by example. I took 3 full weeks off this summer. So just in a single quarter, like we do take time off work. As for introverts, we'll have a hard time. It's funny because in the beginning we thought this model would attract a lot of introverts and wouldn't have any extroverted people. And I can assure you that it's a healthy mix at GitLab. Yeah, remote working can be lonely if you do not go out. My wife doesn't like it. She likes the culture of an office. So it's not for everyone. I like it. And every evening I make sure I have a dinner with someone. And that works for me. But it's not for the entire world, and we're fine with that. We want to be super explicit that we do this, and small thing, but we think this model is going to be called all remote. Work from anywhere. If you Google that, it was like in the 90s and with AOL and Verizon and things like that. We think it's time for clear differentiation between the companies that allow remote and the companies that will not allow you to come to an office, because it's going to be a bigger and big. People are going to start understanding the difference, because if there's no headquarters, you're not at a satellite office. You're not a second-class citizen.
No, I think that's fascinating. So, and I think that's the huge tectonic shift here, which I totally agree. And that's why I was trying to understand how you do the budget allocation. But beyond these 5 concerns, just to wrap up the concerns conversation, Sid. So we talked about time zones, we talked about new hires, we talked about autonomy and how you re-familiarize yourself in this new culture of doing things, and then burnout and isolation. Which of these 5 has been the trickiest issue in your mind to solve?
The trickiest one has been something we didn't discuss, and it's working handbook first. It's making sure that every change that happens at GitLab is affected in the handbook. And Gabe, maybe you can talk about what your experience has been in your previous company, if you're comfortable with doing that publicly.
Yeah, I am. So I had a smaller company, and we made the mistake of trying to do the hybrid approach. 2/3 of our team was distributed across the United States, and 1/3 was in an office. In an attempt to get everybody on the same page, I pushed down from the top that we were going to document everything in the company. We were going to do similar to what GitLab does, but just using GitHub pages at the time. And every change, every policy was going to be reflected, and everybody had to contribute to doing that. But because it wasn't from the beginning of the company, the sales and marketing side of the organization never bought in. And if everybody doesn't buy in, then it doesn't work. And so it's nearly impossible to manage information unless it's written down. And without that discipline, you can't work remote effectively. And so it's a big challenge that I ran into.
Yeah, and Gabe, so excuse my ignorance. Like, can you just tell me a little bit about your are you a co-founder with Sid, or what's your role in GitLab?
I'm a CEO shadow this week. Normally, I'm a senior product manager working in the plan stage, but this is my second week in the shadow rotation.
Okay, and what was the previous company, if you can name that?
Are you going to publish the name?
No, we won't. We will only.
No, but this is going to be a public call, so please put it in the chat instead of talking about it.
Yep.
Okay, sure. And so coming back to the concern, Sid, the concern is that unless you constantly codify, the model will start to break, right? And you're saying that is the trickiest issue right now?
Yeah, that has always been the trickiest issue. It takes so much discipline to put something in the handbook instead of just pinging people on Slack, sending an email, doing all these other ways of asking people to do something. All these other ways are namely much faster because you don't have to find the relevant part of the handbook, restructure it to accommodate your change, make the change, then communicate the change. And also, because it's in context, you'd have to consider the impact on every other process, which you don't have to do if you just tell everyone to do something different. So it's slower, and people don't like slow. But it's kind of go slow to go fast. It's like, I don't know, writing code without tests. Yes, it's faster to get that code written, but in the end, it prevents you from making changes upon changes. It's kind of, that is where you end. Like, you will not be able to accomplish anything beyond that, because kind of the foundation of what you're building is starting to crumble if people have to consult like 5 different sources of truth.
Mm. And what has been the main reason, this has been a problem, and tell me how you've tried to solve it and why it's not working.
Well, it's working, but only through a lot of attention from me. And because I have a lot of control and visibility in the company, but it's been much more difficult than I ever thought. And I think a big reason why every other company that I know of has a handbook, but everyone in the company will say they rarely consult it and it's out of date. I think this is the big reason. It is just more painful for the people who want to have a change take effect. But of course, although it's quicker for them in that moment, that email is going to get lost. In 2 years, no one will know that is the process, and they'll have to rediscover it. So in the end, you end up going slower.
And I wonder, Sid, just thinking aloud, have you thought about automating this process? Like, is there a technological solution to this?
Well, our handbook is in GitLab Pages. That's already a good product, but we want that product to be even better. And so we just started to recruit for a new team, our static site editor team, that will make this even easier to change.
No,
However, go ahead.
What I'm thinking about, so I go to my PCP in the US, and that gentleman now speaks into like a prescription system and documents, and I guess it's just easier for that gentleman to like speak to a system than type something up. And I'm wondering whether contemporaneous to a call, you could capture the voice, transcribe it using some automation, and then just automatically update the handbook without any human intervention.
I think the problem is the structure. So the example you talked about doesn't need any structure because it's your prescription. So it doesn't affect anything else. Mm-hmm. If for you needing to find like where in the hierarchy or the structure does it belong, and then insert it correctly and make sure that like you rearrange the sides of it a bit to make it sure it fits in, that takes extra time. Mm-hmm. And instead of you doing that, you can just say, well, the structure is in people's heads, and I'm just going to push in this new message, and it's up to them to figure out how it works. That's way more inefficient because now 1,000 people have to do it, and they won't do as good of a job, and they'll forget about it. But for you, the sender of the message, that was a lot less work. So are you going to build that house? Are you going to build that written down? Or are you going to build that in people's minds? And most companies answer that question, well, it's really in people's minds. But that means it's different. The house looks different. It means it's weak, it crumbles, it continually deteriorates and needs reinforcement and sending the same message again and again and again and again. There's also problems with our model. Like, for example, there's not a natural aging of messages. Maybe we put stuff in 5 years ago that need to be taken out. We're not taking out a lot of messages. So maybe that's going to be something that will hurt us at scale. But all in all, I think we're able to build a much more beautiful and well-considered house than the mess you get if you have 1,000 people build a house in their minds and then having to agree on what the final product is.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think this is super interesting because, unless, given everything you've done, and I guess you can continually improve this, but this is critical for asynchronous communication as well, right? Because unless in asynchronous, there's no reading of minds, you have to read the documentation.
Yeah, I think people overestimate the ability to read people's minds in synchronous communication as well.
That's true. That's true. So what is the future there? Like, you've tried a bunch of things and it's your constant pushing and nudging people. I wonder, like, either technologically or managerially, what is the solution to the problem? What's your hypothesis?
It's both making it easier to do like the technical editing, but also convincing people that this is the way, and it becoming something that people do. We recently added handbook first to like our leadership criteria. You cannot be a good manager at GitLab if you do not reinforce handbook first.
Because you know what, I'm thinking aloud, Sid, but if this is the issue that bothers you as the CEO, then it deserves more attention from me and Emma, and maybe we can dive deeper in a follow-up call with someone, even you, trying to understand the handbook first process, and then trying to understand where it breaks, and trying to understand and making it that whole thing, the discussion, a more central part of the case study.
Cool. Thanks for being open to that.
So I think we should definitely brainstorm that, and you can point me to whoever is the right person to talk to about understanding the whole process, and then, brainstorming about what possible solutions, both technologically and managerially.
Yeah, I think Gabe is helpful because he's seen it break down. So I think Darren is helpful. We have a handbook usage page, and maybe the product manager for the static site editor can also join that conversation.
Okay,
and
great.
I think with those 4 people, you'll be well served. And I'd be happy to do a follow-up call if you don't get everything out of that call that you want to.
Absolutely. So Emma, maybe we can reach out to Gabe and schedule that meeting.
Yeah, Gabe will set it up.
Awesome. Just one last thing before I let you go. So as we were doing the research about the company, and I'm sure the students will bring this up, we found the news article about hiring from China, right? So can you tell me your thoughts on that? And so this is clearly one more friction about working from anywhere, because now, because of regulatory or other reasons, you cannot hire people from that country, right?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a bit of distortion. We hire people in China. We have customers in China. We have contributors to GitLab in China. That is not the conversation. The conversation is for the people at GitLab that have access to the production data of GitLab.com. For example, some of our site reliability engineers, are we going to hire them in China or Russia? And there's the reason that there's 2 things. First of all, we're a transparent company. So we had that discussion in the open, which led people to take things out of context. So we're not going to repeat that mistake with things that have to do with countries and nationalities, because they seem to be something that is very core to people's identities. The second thing is, it's almost weird, because if a normal company wouldn't want to hire for a certain role in a certain country, they just wouldn't open up the vacancy. With us, all vacancies are like everywhere in the world unless specified otherwise. So we made it a bit more difficult on ourselves. We could have also just listed the 250 countries we hired for this function in. We haven't done that yet. Maybe we should, maybe not. Maybe most people understand in context that for GitLab.com, it's mainly used by US companies, and Russia and China are cyber adversaries of the US. If we would open up a GitLab SaaS service in China, maybe we wouldn't hire anybody in the US for that. Like it's not about one country being better or people being better than the other. It's about hiring near data. Like where's the data stored, who uses it, and making sure that the people are near there, because there will always be tension in the world.
There's a 3-minute warning, and also I think we did just add a page that lists all of the countries that we can and can't hire in. I'll put it in the chat.
Okay. Thanks.
So I guess I've gone through my questions, Sid. I just want to make sure, and I'll explain the process going forward in a second. So beyond the handbook issue, is there any other big issue that we haven't talked about that you constantly think about or that concerns you?
Well, one thing that I don't think is a good fit for the all remote subject, but on the subject of China, I spent a ton of time thinking about how to offer GitLab as a service in China, and whether that should be a fully owned enterprise, a joint venture, or a company we're a minor shareholder in, or whether we shouldn't do it at all. But I don't think it's a good fit for all remote, and that might be the gist of your article.
Right. So I guess, the process for us would be, I think we have a couple of interviews left, and then Emma and I will work on the draft and hopefully send you something early January. And then you can read it, give us feedback on that. It's very collaborative. And then at that point, we might request for a couple of more calls. and then hopefully early spring we publish this. And then I'm going to teach it in my second year elective at HPS, and I would love to invite you to the classroom, or maybe it's your choice if you want to physically come in or do like a session like this, which might be actually more appropriate. But that's the roadmap going.
I'd love to participate, and let's do that like this.
Yeah. Sounds great. So do you have any other questions for me at this point?
Are you okay with publishing this call on our Unfiltered YouTube channel?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No worries.
Awesome. Chenye will get in touch with you about that.
Okay. Sounds good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the questions. You did a great job of finding things that we are struggling with at the company, and it was fun to discuss them with you.
Yeah, well, thank you, sir. Thanks for your insights. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care. Yeah.